So, turning next to Locke, who is the second key character we're introduced to, on the surface we see a happy-go-lucky thief, or treasure hunter, as he frequently attempts to posit himself. But again, with the theme of duality at play, we see Locke harbours a deep sadness that contrasts strongly with his surface-level, affable nature, and through his inability to reconcile with the regrets of his past, which prompts him to have joined the Returners in the first place in a effort to try and wrestle this guilt from himself. Indeed, the psychology of regret is deep-seated and all-consuming, when we look at Locke, and it's to the extent that it is debilitating and an altering aspect of his personality. Among the main causes of regret from a psychological perspective are inaction or action, basically a moment in time that the sufferer looks back to where a decision was taken that echoed out towards a negative outcome, and their inability to kind of get over that. And looking at Locke's character, we can append this to perhaps two key instances. The first being his inaction, his inability to look after Rachel during their visit to Mount Colts, or perhaps even it was the action of taking her there in the first place that is the first and most prominent cause of his regret. A second prominent cause of regret is a lost opportunity, and this is apparent in Locke's regret again in a second instance which concerns Rachel, and that is of course her death at the hands of Imperial troops. And of course this happens while he's exiled from the town. So the fact he didn't get to see or speak to her for so long, and the fact that he failed to save her in these two instances, has severely altered his personality and his character, which is evident in two key ways beneath his surface level charisma. Firstly, he's joined the Returners, and this is an arbitrary response to the fact that Rachel was killed by the Empire. So, much like Barrett from Final Fantasy VII, who basically joins Avalanche as a vehicle for his revenge against Shinra, Locke joins the Returners as an actionable and violent response to the Empire, killing Rachel, which he is actually eventually quite forthcoming about. Secondly, in each instance we see a female character in distress in the game, particularly with Terra and Celis. Locke goes out of his way in an attempt to protect them, oft times when it's not even required. The women in question, of course, are an enhanced Magitech Knight and, again, a Magitech General for the Empire. One thing I really liked, actually, looking at Locke's regret and his inability to get over the past and, this kind of weight he drags around with him, is the fact that Rachel, physically, Rachel's presence is in Collinheim during the game events, and I think this is symbolic of her spiritual and mental presence in Locke's mind. Her stasis, hovering between life and death, is emblematic of Locke's inability to let her go and forgive himself of these regrets. So it's a very literal representation of grief that we see play out in Locke's narrative, and ultimately, towards the end of the game, his confrontation with this grief is presented literally as well, which is when we see the Phoenix Esper briefly resurrecting Rachel, just long enough for him to get closure and assuage him of this guilt that permits him then to move on with his life. I think is a very touching moment, and it shows how Final Fantasy VI as a game really pushed the boundaries with character growth and story, and worked with some quite hard-hitting themes and narratives, in these individual character subplots. Finally, just noting on the etymology of Locke's name, it seems like it could relate to the philosopher John Locke, due to the spelling, which is identical and quite uncommon, and it's also in keeping with Square's infrequent forays into cultural naming conventions, and philosophical naming conventions as well, because of course we have a few instances. One that jumps out at me right at the moment is Heidegger from Final Fantasy VII, which is of course named after another philosopher, and quite an uncommon Germanic name. Having said that, there's no direct parallels or anything symbolic that I can find between John Locke's writings that I could argue, can be appended to Locke as a reason for his name. But I would argue that the philosopher did believe and wrote about the fundamental goodness of mankind. He believed in ethical and moral goodness, which he wrote about extensively. And this is certainly a belief that we could say Locke in Final Fantasy VI does subscribe to. So, yeah, ultimately quite an abstract but not impossible, theory for why this naming convention may have occurred.